It's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Barry Pecos. Dr. Pecos may be known to many of you already. You've likely seen and heard him on the news throughout the pandemic, as he's on the front lines of the pandemic response generally. And with others, he continues to lead the Kol HaKovid Jewish community response to COVID-19, so you may know him from there. As you will hear, Dr. Pecos and THMP have had a continuing dialogue throughout the pandemic. He's been extremely helpful to us and has provided us with protocols to keep families, clergy, and staff safe. Dr. Pecos is a physician with a public health specialty. He is assistant professor and the program director of the Public Health and Preventive Medicine Residency Program at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health. He is also the global health lead for undergraduate and postgraduate medical education at the University of Toronto. His clinical practice is in emergency medicine. He also provides primary care in Northern Ontario, and he is a MOA. Dr. Pecos has experience working in public health locally and territorially in both Northern and Indigenous communities and globally at the World Health Organization, where he has led work on pandemic ethic frameworks, incorporating halachic perspectives into global pandemic response. He has had recent public health leadership roles in the health unit of Nunavut, Middlesex, London, most recently as Associate Medical Officer of Health in Peel Region, where he led the COVID response and outbreak management in workplaces, shelters, hospitals, and with marginalized and vulnerable populations. Dr. Pecos has degrees from Harvard, McGill, and U of T, including a PhD in public health ethics. He's lived in Israel, served in the IDF, and has taught at Hebrew University's School of Public Health, as well as at Ben Gurion's and Tel Aviv's medical schools. Dr. Pecos is a third-generation Torontonian and a Chat and Yeshiva graduate. He continues to learn weekly with the Kollel Beit Midrash Zichron Dov and serves on the board of the Or Chaim Minyan. He and his wife, Dr. Brenda Weitzner, and their 5 daughters live in the Clanton Park neighborhood. I'm honored to call on Dr. Barry Pecos.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to your annual general meeting. It's really an honor to be here. And most importantly, thank you for all the work that you do on behalf of the community. I was asked to share a few thoughts about Toronto Hebrew Memorial Parks, and its executive director, Howard Mammon, have not only had a role, obviously, as you know, in comforting and serving the living who are mourning for their loved ones, but also in saving lives during this pandemic. I must admit that I've lived in Toronto my whole life, 4th generation Torontonian on one side, and never have had to give much thought to how our cemeteries are organized, and certainly never heard of Toronto Hebrew Memorial Parks other than getting pulled into Kaddish as the 10th man or during my 20 years in university, which happened reasonably often. But like many parts of our critical parts of our community's infrastructure, it's invisible until you really need them. I know you know that. I know as a public health physician, public health is invisible until it's realized that it's important by the general population or by the government. So I certainly really appreciate, and everyone does in the community, all the work that your organization does. When the pandemic began, I was and am the Associate Medical Officer of Health in Peel Region, just to the west of Toronto, leading the response to workplace outbreaks and hospital outbreaks and the pandemic more generally. And early on in the pandemic, in early March, I, like many others, was really worried about the state in the Jewish community with various holidays coming up, Purim right at the beginning, and then Pesach, and just generally what had been going on in New York and other places in the world. And so a group of physicians got together along with some other community members to form the Toronto Jewish Coronavirus Task Force, called COVID. And we worked at the time to fill some of the gaps, off the side of our table, to respond collectively to some of the issues that, whether it's the Vada Rabbanim or members of the public or other community organizations had, and try to respond to the pandemic as a community. And I can't remember exactly how it happened, but I became connected with THMP and Howard, whether it was through the Chevra Kadisha, where we had a lot of back and forth there as well about how to treat COVID positive or unknown deaths in the community. And then we connected around how to safely conduct funerals after the emergency measures came in. It seems like, it seems like many years ago, and a lot of the things we talked about at the time seem really intuitive now. But back then it certainly wasn't. And everyone was under a lot of stress, and it was really terrific to work with Howard and THMP and the other, organizations doing similar work in the community to make sure that everyone was on the same page and it was clear what they needed to be doing when, in a situation of a lot of lack of clarity. And out of that relationship, and I think that was, really important in the first few weeks of COVID, was a really important back and forth that continued and continues until now. The reason I'm speaking to you today is because some of the impact of that relationship, I think, is beyond what many people might realize, beyond what we might want to share with everyone. But community institutions like THMP obviously perform such an essential function, and I know you know that, you're on the board. But for someone like me from the outside, it's always important to remind you of that. As a public health practitioner, motivating dramatic behavior change like we needed at the beginning of the pandemic and still need now, we can do it with emergency orders, but it's really important to motivate people on the inside and for them to change their behavior, and for community leaders to be able to reliably communicate that to people to keep them safe. Especially among a group like Jews, they're historically fundamentally different and like to let people know that that's the case, and are different in many important ways that actually I didn't appreciate until the pandemic. One of those was how much we gather together. The average number of contacts for your observant Jew is around 120 per week, or many more, as we've seen, whereas the Ontario average is 12. So when you need to restrict the number of people you're interacting with by 90%, when the average person does that, it gets down to 2. When the Jewish observant person does that, it gets down to way above 12, which is the baseline for Ontarians. So, we were at a higher risk. And when you're communicating that, sometimes people listen to graphs and numbers and stories in other places. Other people listen more to narratives that affect them personally. And I think in the situation of the pandemic early on, and like I said, continuing till now, the best place was in the middle ground, where you're presenting people with some numbers and understanding of what's going on, and also narratives that people can relate to. And that's where THMP really came in, was that in talking to Howard and understanding what's going on in the community, I was able to do some back of the envelope epidemiologic calculations and realize that in fact the deaths in the Jewish community were a multiple, about 2.5 times what they were in the rest of the community. We don't always have good data. In fact, we have poor data. We don't even know how many Jews are in Canada, because since the 2016 census, we've been halved from our previous number. So, there aren't a lot of ways to collect this data, and THMP and Howard was really the only place to get this. And those numbers, when I communicated them, not only to, back to him and to some others, but really to community leaders and organizations, it was one of the most impactful tools in motivating those organizations to, develop some protocols in their, in their settings, and to communicate that to their members, specifically the Vada Rabbanim and many shuls really were able to respond when we were able to communicate some of the reasons why the Jewish community was at a higher risk, and also that it wasn't just theoretical. It wasn't happening in New York or London or Brazil or Israel, but it was happening right here in Toronto. And that connection is still ongoing and really critically important. And some of that was actually communicated right to the Chief Medical Officer of Ontario's office and the Chief Medical Officer himself, to guide some of the House of Worship guidelines and to try to steer it in a direction that made sense for the Jewish community. Because again, we were, pretty different than other communities, but there were some other communities like us, and some of this data was actually really helpful for other communities. The Muslim community was really dramatically affected, and they have a terrific coronavirus task force that actually put ours to shame. But some of the sort of understanding of the situation in the Jewish community that was adequately described by the death data that I could communicate to them, they were able to understand that different communities are actually different, and that impacted, some of the House of Worship guidance and other guidance that affected us. and other faith communities. Not the Christian community. I spoke to the archbishops and many others, and it just wasn't an issue with them. And that's why this data was so really important, because people just didn't understand why it was important for us. So that regular communication with THMP and that leadership that Howard, I think, took on certainly, early on and right through, communicating regularly with all the stakeholders and everybody involved was really, really important. Very clear and concise communications, but also complete and comprehensive with all the reasoning in there that I think everybody needed at the time. So the bottom line is that we do have a long way to go now, and with the next 6 months to a year at the very least, if not much longer, where we'll continue to rely on organizations like THMP and other community organizations, whether it be the Toronto Board of Rabbis, the UJA, other community leadership, to be a source for information and guidance and support for the entire community. COVID, as we all know, has been so transformative and allowed so many people and organizations to take a much bigger leadership role than they had in the past. And in that way, I think it's been in some ways, if you can find a positive a silver lining to it, that may be one of those silver linings. Those difficult decisions that individuals had to make, including putting together the protocols and forms in funeral homes and shutting the cemetery up ultimately, which was a necessary decision, but that sort of took quite a bit of leadership and decisiveness, and I think we're going to still need more of that from everyone involved in community leadership going forward. So I want to thank you all for participating in THMP and being here today. As I said, we still have a long way to go, and we were, I think, quite successful. Not to pat ourselves too much on the back, but both as Canadians and as a Jewish community, successful in preventing the first wave from being potentially much worse than it could have been. And we have a lot of work now to do in the second wave to make sure that we're keeping safe and responding appropriately. So thank you again for having me. I really appreciate relationship so far with THMP and with Howard, and looking forward to it in the future as well.
Dr. Pecos, thank you for your insights and guidance in dealing with the COVID-19 virus and its impact on not only the Jewish community, but the community at large. Thank you again.